uh, lobbed onto in researching philosophy. What is the most interesting thing that you can find in philosophy, the most useful? And it was always the distinctions for me, and trying to be a good debater or be good at conversations. It was finding where someone's claim landed in these distinctions, and from being able to do that, I could then identify like where the problems were, where the general criticisms of their position would be based off of how they applied to these distinctions and what the criticisms of those distinctions were. So that was definitely the most useful thing I found in philosophy for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think the other thing that's useful about is mapping out the sort of logical space. So, you can say, well, if I start here, then here are the branches I can follow. And if I accept this, I'll go that way. So I think that a large part of the progress is we get to understand the questions better and what the possible answers to them might be. And that's really, I think, the primary contribution. Besides, the personal contribution of knowing thyself, the Socratic thing, which I think is important, actually. That we don't want to mistake that philosophy is in part self-exploration, obviously, but as far as like what objectively it contributes outside of personal growth or something like that, I think this is those two things: understand the questions better, the distinctions, and mapping out the logical space.
Yeah, it's also helped me a lot to understand other people's worldviews, because using my like worldview model where I just have the number line with all the facts and then try to place in the distinctions and seeing how my worldview lines up, and then working with other people to do that and see how theirs differs, especially seeing how the difference between a materialist and an idealist or a dualist and how theirs lines up. It puts things in perspective and helps me to understand the other worldviews a lot better, to be able to see it in a like a picture visual sense like that.
Yeah, and that's valuable, actually. I think that Russell has that famous quote where Bertrand Russell, where he says, like, the value of philosophy. I'm paraphrasing or something. He says the value of philosophy is it sort of shakes this dogma that we have and opens your mind to new ways of seeing the world, which you might not have thought before. And that's just something we talked about last time. Sort of steel manning. That was your term that you used. Steel manning the other position. This is part of it. Sort of putting yourself. Why would a reasonable person come to this conclusion? Understanding that your way of looking at things is not the only way to look at things is important. You may not agree with it, but at least you can say, well, why would someone who's not a fucking idiot accept this thing? I think that's the best way to think about it. It's like, okay, we may disagree. That doesn't mean you're a moron.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because you're always tempted to do that. Like, that's such a stupid position. How could anyone believe that?
Yeah.
And you got to like try and figure out how you could make their position as strong as possible. And that seems to be like, I think that's my favorite form of debate, because me and Ask Yourself, another YouTuber guy, we're having a debate privately about what's the best method of debating or the best strategy. And he uses strict formal arguments. Like, you must put your position into a formal argument so I can dissect it. And their inability to do that shows their ignorance of philosophy or whatever. And when they try to do that, it shows they can't formulate their argument in a way, which is very useful because it shows that they haven't really put together a coherent worldview. But at the same time, I think that my strategy, which is to take whatever their position is and to make it as strong as it can possibly be, even if they haven't thought through it that much, I'm going to make it as strong as I could be, and then attack that position, seems to be more useful than his strategy. And that's our personal debate.
Yeah, I actually watched one of your dumpster fires with, I think it was that Ask Yourself guy, who I didn't see his face. It was just a picture of a guy going like this or something like that. So yeah, I listened to a little bit. It was kind of hard after a while. I couldn't take it anymore, but I did listen to some of it. So some of the most famous arguments in philosophy, I'd say, are tough to formalize. Think about Hume's argument against induction. Is that an inductive argument, a deductive argument? Well, according to his own view, deductive arguments don't tell you anything about the world, right? They only tell you about concepts and conceptual relations. So he can't really be thinking that he's putting forth a formal argument, but he's also arguing against induction. So, how do you so I still think it's one of the most important arguments that exists in the history of philosophy, but difficult to formalize. And so if that's the mark of a good argument, I think that's a kind of narrow criteria. Obviously, I like formal arguments and I teach logic and I like logic a lot, but I think there's more to life than formal arguments.
Definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of really confusing arguments in philosophy, like Hume's arguments against causation. Like, how can there not be causation? Trying to figure out what he means by that is a very confusing thing.
Yeah, well, that was what I was sort of alluding to, exactly. But I don't think you can formalize it, even though I think the argument's very important. I think, so I don't think that I mean, I don't want to get too distracted right off the bat. Maybe, well, who knows? Why? Fuck it, we're here. Let's talk. But I think that Hume's argument against causation is an argument against a specific idea about what causation is, that it's a necessary connection between events in nature. Because he gives another definition of cause and effect that's just counterfactual. Like if the first thing didn't happen, the second thing wouldn't happen. So Hume believes in cause and effect, but he just like he also believes in free will, but he doesn't believe. But he's a compatibilist about free will, and he's this kind of regularity theorist about cause and effect. But he still thinks there are such things as causes in the world. It's just that they are not necessary. I think so. I don't think he really is denying that there are cause and effects. I just think he has a view about what cause and effect is.
Definitely.
Regularity.
Yeah, I think it's fun to actually try to think of a way that you could get rid of all cause and effect completely. Just think of every single particle as a completely random particle that has no interaction with other particles, and they're just randomly organized in such a way that it produces this simulated world that seems to be here, but it's purely just by chance with no causation, and they'd all just be like computer particles that just pass through each other without noticing. If it could be hilarious, but it's still possible.
Yeah, well, I don't know. So I think I mean, my interpretation of like quantum mechanics and string theory and things of that nature are that these categories have been displaced. I mean, I don't think cause and effect plays a role in these fundamental theories of physics, not in the sense that you're talking about anyway. So I think what we call cause and effect maybe is emergent property at the macro level, but it doesn't seem like it's a property of microphysics, or at least certain microphysical theories. So that's perfect. I mean, it seems perfectly coherent. What do you have? You have state transitions, obviously, but you don't have anything causing it. I mean, so you observe the thing, it's heads or tails, but what caused it to be that way? The answer is, according to quantum mechanics, nothing.
Yeah, the way I interpret it, I actually had a debate with Rob Coons recently, and his Thomistic position that there is the causeness, the causality itself, God idea. And I took the approach that, well, cause is a label kind of like chair, and it applies to specific physical phenomenon. So change would be like the energy transfer from one point to another point, and we call that thing change. But there could also be other kinds of change, like changes in states of Hilbert space, and we also call that change. So there isn't really a changeness. It's change is just a label we apply to certain physical properties.
Yeah, at the macro level. It's at the micro level, all you have is a bunch of equations, and the equations tell you have a certain state and it transitions to another state, but there's nothing in there that tells you what makes it come. I'm very suspicious about people relying on these notions of cause. That's one of the problems with the cosmological argument, or the Kalam cosmological arguments, these things that rely a lot tracing back. I guess you said Thomism, so yeah. I always thought that was funny, by the way, as a non, call it Aquinian. We call it Thomism. Like, why did we do that? No one else gets that first name privilege in philosophy. But yeah, the Thomists, they're very big on this idea of cause and effect. Myself, I don't put a lot of stock into that, and that's why I think those arguments actually aren't that great, personally.
Yeah, well, we are currently live and sound is good.
Oh, we are?
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
Hey! Richard, thanks for coming on. Look, I think your ear thing fell out there. That was pretty funny.
Yeah, I didn't realize we were live. Okay. What did I say?
Record. Like, I can blackmail you with this. So we are live. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, sure. I mean, my name's Richard, as you already said. And what did I already said some stuff about me, did with the stuff about teaching or whatever. Yeah. So I teach at the City University of New York. I like philosophy and neuroscience and the interrelation between the two. And I especially think about consciousness, but I have interest in all sorts of other things. And so, yeah, that's me. Cool.
So what should we talk about today?
Well, there's lots that we could talk about today. I guess so there's a few things I was going to ask you, and then I guess some things that may come up sort of in intermediary. But one thing that I noticed that you do a lot is that you like to, I don't know if you do it a lot, but anyway, I've noticed a couple times that you are very dismissive of the ontological argument for God's existence. And so I want to defend that a little bit, I guess I would say, in a limited sense. So I obviously, my position. I don't accept the conclusion of the argument. I reject it, actually, but I think it's a serious argument. And I guess I would say that it's a serious argument for a more limited conclusion. And this kind of goes to what I think is the basis of a lot of your debates, actually, because a lot of what you're doing is a reason to believe in God, or is it rational to accept the existence of God? And so I think that the ontological argument, and this is the way I read Plantinga's version of it, is that it's not really doesn't establish the existence of a God, but what it does is it makes it rational for a person to accept the existence of a God. And so that's a much more limited claim. And so I am curious what you think about that. You think that's that more restricted version of it, simply because I think a lot of work, like people like Plantinga, I think a lot of what they want to do is simply try to make room for their views not being called irrational, right? It's not just like, oh, we believe in a zombie Jewish guy who rose from the dead and this, weird talking snake so there's all that weird aspects of it. But I think that they want to be able to say there's something serious here that a reasonable person could accept. And so that's the way I read that version of the argument. We can go through the premises and whatever, but I just wonder what your general reaction to that, what that strategy of his or of a person like that might be.
Right, absolutely. That's the argument I'm going against, because I want to say that it's equally as irrational to believe in the God as it is to believe in the real Santa Claus. I think that there's equal justification for those, and I don't think the ontological argument works any more for God than it does for a perfect island, to use the classical counter argument, or a perfect Santa Claus. So I think that Plantinga's argument is a perfect example of what I'm arguing against. I want to say that it is irrational to believe in a God, whereas he wants to show how it's rational to believe in a God. So his arguments are a great exemplar for my viewpoint and my epistemology to try and test against his views.
Yeah, but I don't really see what the argument is. And specifically, so I know the Guanillo perfect island thing, but I don't really think that's a serious rebuttal. I mean, I guess I think it's interesting that you think that's a serious rebuttal. And the basic, probably you've talked to someone about this, so I would like to hear what you have to say. But the basic response is simply that there's a relevant difference, which is that the concept of a perfect island is incoherent in a sense, because you can always imagine improving the island. So you can't really conceive of a perfect island. And that's different from the concept of a maximally great being, which you can't conceive of any way in which it can be improved. So the perfect island is more like highest number, right? There's no highest number. You can't conceive of the highest number. Fun fact, when I was 10, I thought I had done this, by the way. Then I proved myself wrong a few minutes later. But anyway, so anyway, so there's no highest number, and you can't conceive of that, right? You can't even form the concept of the highest number, because you can simply improve it or increase it by adding 1 to it, or 0.5 or whatever. And so the perfect island is a bit like that. Say, describe the perfect island. I say, well, add one more, cherry sundae, one more chocolate fountain, one more whatever it is, and it's a little bit better. So, but with the idea of a maximally great being, you can't do that. So this is a thing which can't be improved. And so there is a relevant difference between the perfect island and the perfect being, I guess I think.
So my objection would be is that this idea of perfect greatness is being argued to be some kind of a real property in the universe. So like there must be some objective measure of what this greatness thing is. And we could conceive of different measures of the greatness thing. There could be a measure that says the greatest possible thing is made of spaghetti. And if it's not made of spaghetti, then it's not the greatest possible thing. So we could say, well, the spaghetti monster is the greatest possible thing. Well, no. See, that's not the greatest thing, because the Thomist says, no, it has to be a conscious mind. That has to be the greatest possible thing. And I can say, well, no, there's the island. The island is the greatest possible thing, and it can't be any greater, because I really like islands. I'm an island guy. So the problem is when you attribute this property of greatness, and you say that there is this greatest possible thing, where there has to be some way, some measurement of what this greatness is, and how one pole is the greatest thing and one other pole is not the greatest thing, or whatever, or just a different direction. And if you don't have some way to demonstrate that your particular interpretation of what greatness means is the correct interpretation, well, then it's no different than saying the perfect island is the greatest possible thing, or the spaghetti monster is the greatest possible thing, or the ice cream cone is the greatest possible thing, until you can actually show that your particular definition of this term actually corresponds to something in reality other than just your imagination. And there's no reason to believe it's true other than just...
Well, we're not saying it's true. We're just talking about a concept. So we haven't even got to the past. So we're just sort of saying, this is why if you skip all the Plantinga stuff and go back to the original source, like St. Anselm, I think it's pretty clever, the strategy that he uses, because he's saying, look, we know what a maximally great being is. We know what it is. Or if you say you don't, then what is it you say you don't believe in if you're an atheist? So the atheist has to have this concept of a maximally great being. Otherwise, their position is absurd. Doesn't make any sense. They're denying the existence of something that they don't understand, they don't know how to think about, or they can't form the concept of, in which case their view isn't very serious. So I think that's kind of that way you set yourself up for an easy rebuttal from the other side. So we do know what it means to be maximally great. It means having the traditional properties of being all-knowing, all-powerful, morally perfect. So such that with the spaghetti monster, and this is a trick that a lot of people want to pull. So if the spaghetti monster has those properties, then the spaghetti monster is just another name for this maximally great being. In which case, the argument goes through. The spaghetti monster is God, and blah blah blah. So otherwise, you can improve it. So how powerful is the spaghetti monster? What can it do? Well, then have it do a little bit more. How good is the spaghetti monster? Is it sort of good, kind of good, perfectly good? Well, if you define, so I think that these ideas, don't get me wrong. I think that you can derive contradictions from these ideas. I do. And, we've talked about that before. And the free will stuff, if God knows what he's going to do in advance, then he can't be free. That seems like a contradiction. If God is all powerful, then there seems to be a contradiction already there, because he created beings that he can't control, namely us, with our free will. So can he control us or not? I think you get into a weird contradiction there. Does he know the omnipotence? Does he know? So that's the contradiction from omnipotence, a contradiction from knowing everything. Does he know what he will do? So I think there are problems with that, but nonetheless, I think we know what that means. We can understand what it means. And sometimes people like that say to me, like, well, you don't really know what it means to be to be all knowledgeable. And I kind of think, yeah, I do actually. It would be like feeling like I already feel, but just being right all the time. If you ask me a question and I tell you the answer, I tend to be wrong a lot of the times. But being omniscient would be just like that, but actually getting it right. It's just, you just know the answer. So I don't think that there's any conceptual problem understanding what it means to be all powerful, all knowing, morally perfect. And that's what we mean by maximally great.
Right. So my objection here would be is that I could take all of those properties. So you have this collection of 6 things, perfections, which is just a different word for property, apparently. But you have these 6 perfections. I could say, well, let's get rid of one. Let's say there's no consciousness in this thing. It's just naturalistic pantheism. Just you got the eternal, you got the all powerful, you got the everything that's required to create the universe, but there's no consciousness, and we keep everything else. Now
so therefore, no morally perfect, moral.
Nope.
Perfect.
You can keep those too. You don't need a consciousness for those, but that's a separate argument. But so we'll just get rid of the consciousness, keep everything else, and this is the perfect thing. This is the maximally great being. You're adding in this extra thing just like for no reason. We don't need that consciousness for anything, just like I could add in spaghetti. So you have the 3 different hypotheses. You have the God hypothesis, which has, I think, 6 perfections. Then you have naturalistic pantheism, which has 5 or 3 perfections, just eternal, all-powerful, or I think whatever the other one is, don't remember, but just the 3 perfections or 5 perfections, just get rid of one of them. And then you have one with an extra perfection of spaghetti. So it's everything God is plus spaghetti. And all of these 3 hypotheses could all be labeled as the maximally great being. Which one is true, which one is not the true maximally great being? Because if it's just based off of opinion, well, then there's no objective correlate in the world to this maximally great being. It's just, I have a feeling that I like this thing, and so I want this to exist, whereas I have a feeling I want this thing and this thing to exist. So until you can actually go this step further to show that this particular conception of the maximal greatness is the one that corresponds to reality rather than your imagination, then it isn't rational to believe that this argument actually holds, because it doesn't correspond to anything other than your imagination.
Yeah. So there's 3 things I would say about that. First, I'm very suspicious about this move about naturalistic pantheism. And I know that there are people that have had this view, and, whatever. Leibniz is probably one of the famous ones, right? Or is it Spinoza? I always get them mixed.
Pantheism, Spinoza.
Yeah, exactly.
His was a little different because he did believe in a consciousness of some kind.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I always get those 2 confused. I'm not a buff on those guys, a history buff.
Yeah, because Leibniz, best of all possible worlds, super religious. He thought this was the best of all possible worlds.
Yeah, that's that guy. Yeah.
Oh, silly.
Yeah, that's super annoying. I mean, Voltaire just roasted the shit out of that view. That Dr. Pangloss, if you've ever read that, have you read this Candide before?
I think so. A long time ago.
You should. Yeah, you should reread it. Dr. Pangloss is just marvelous character of a dipshit person who's just constantly, well, we have noses. Clearly they are made for glasses. The best of all possible world, right? So anyway, so I forgot what I was going to say. Oh yeah, so the naturalistic pantheist thing. I guess the problem I have with that is that I assume that if something is like a god, whether it's the universe or a being, then part of the definition of that is worthy of worshiping. And I do not believe that the universe itself is worthy of worshiping. In fact, I don't even, by the way, I personally don't believe that even if there were a God, that it would be worthy of worship. I just don't think it's appropriate to have that attitude towards anything, as a matter of fact, whether it's a God or not. But anyway, so that's why I think that, yeah, so at least I can understand why someone might have this feeling like they should worship a God, but I don't understand why someone would feel the need to worship the universe. Which seems to me to sort of be a problem for the pantheism part, because if it's really theism, then I think that it's got to be including this idea that it's worthy of worship.
Well, not really. So I agree that usually in the concept of God, you think of a conscious entity of some kind, and this has no consciousness, so it wouldn't qualify as the traditional idea of a God. But naturalistic pantheism essentially is the position that it's the scientific view that you essentially adopt no more extra ontologies than those granted by science. So it's just naturalism, essentially. It's just a fancy word for naturalism. But
it isn't, though. That's the kind of point I'm making. Sorry to interrupt you, by the way, Tom. Sorry about
fine,
that.
That's fine.
It isn't just a fancy word for naturalism because of the worshiping business. That was the point I was trying to make. So
so I was getting there.
Plus I want to worship it. It's like is worthy of worship.
Right, I was getting there. So that part seems to be, you have an opinion that that's required in the idea of some kind of a theism, but I wouldn't agree with that. I don't think that is required. I think there are many different versions of God that have nothing to do with worship. Like there are evil gods all over mythology. So the worthy of worship thing doesn't seem to be a requirement for a God in most intuitions. So I don't think that's really, unless you could again show that that concept you have corresponds to something in reality, then I don't think that that interpretation is rational to believe is true about the world any more so than the alternative that it's just nature or just evil gods can exist that aren't worthy of worship or that are worthy of disworship or hating them or whatever. So I don't think that would,
but even gods, let's suppose for a second that there are some. Who's the famous evil god? Is it Baal or whatever? I don't know. Some evil god. Even those people think demand worshiping, and I think that it is part of the concept of, if it's a god, then it's something which commands a certain attitude towards it, or that it's at least worthy of that attitude. So maybe it's an evil god, maybe it's not worship but condemnation or something, but anyway, so yeah, I otherwise I wouldn't call it pantheism. So why is it pantheism as opposed to, it's just naturalism? What you're talking about, just naturalism, is that there's the physical universe. But to call it naturalistic pantheism is to say that the physical universe is itself a special entity that deserves a special attitude from us. Otherwise, it's just relabeling the other package.
I don't see that, because like there are many gods that don't, many religions that have no conception that we even know they exist in many cases. I don't see that as anything more than an opinion. I don't see that as like a property in a god that if there are humans, we're supposed to have an attitude towards it. I don't see there's any ontological thing in a god being that has that anywhere in it. This just seems to be an opinion.
Yeah, I guess I'm not really, it wouldn't be a problem for me if it was just an opinion, I guess, since it's a widely shared opinion. But certainly as part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Judeo-Islamic tradition, that whole tradition that God is worthy or demands worship and blah, blah, blah. So that there are other gods in in other traditions. I mean, I guess you're thinking of Gnosticism. I guess I'm not clear, like what is it that, like, which other of these, what kinds of positions are you thinking of where we don't know the God that exists or something like that?
Well, there's lots of different gods in Hinduism. Some of them you worship, some of them you don't worship. There are lots of different gods in the Greek and Zeus.
Depends on the version of Hinduism.
What?
Depends on the version of Hinduism?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So there's lots of different versions of religions. The the Norse mythology religions, some gods you worship, some gods you don't. Some things are greater than gods, you don't worship them. There's the Zeus you worship and you praise the gods of Olympia. You don't praise Hades and the bad gods. There's gods like Echo who created echoes that you don't worship. There's all kinds of different conceptions of gods. There are people who worship nature, but that doesn't seem to be a requirement. There's like Buddhism, you don't worship the Dharma. It's just a thing that's there. You don't worship the ideas; they're just a thing. So I don't see this.
Why is that a problem for the claim that I'm making? Because what you're offering is, by the way, we're getting a little distracted because I wanted to talk about the other thing. But let's finish this first because.
Well, I think that my criticism, I don't see the relevance to what this has to do with the argument. So the criticism here is you're saying that it needs to be worthy of worship. I'm like, why? I don't get it. Yeah, I don't get it. Like, I don't see the relevance to the two connections. So I can see there's lots of gods that aren't worthy of worship. I don't see why that's relevant to the claim. I don't see how that follows in the argument.
There are no, let's put it this way. There are no maximally great beings which should lack this property and still be called a god.
Well, then I'd go back to my original criticism. Like, there's no maximally great being that should lack the property of spaghetti. Show one of these claims is more reasonable or more likely to correspond to reality than another.
Yeah, but that's not really that's not charitable. I guess I'd say.
Oh, right. It's just what's it?
Ad hominem,
no,
ad hoc.
The one that's reductio. So it's reductio. If we take this seriously, that we can take any property and say, I don't think that the maximally great being should be without this property. Well, I just pick any ridiculous property I want. And I could do the same thing and pick a more charitable version like naturalistic pantheism, which is just nature.
Yeah. I mean, so that's Plantinga has a line on this. He calls it, there are certain properties called great making properties, and there are other properties which are not. So being made of spaghetti is not a great making property, I guess.
Well, yeah, I'd go back to the same thing. Okay, why not? Why do you choose these as the correct great making properties and not these? It seems to be arbitrary. You're just randomly picking these. I can just pick a different one.
Do you really believe that, though? Do you really think that there's no difference, that there isn't a difference between being made of spaghetti and being all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect? They seem really different.
Well, I'd say like being made of consciousness.
Cool, and the other seems like, cool, I guess.
I think it depends on your worldview. So like if you're Hindu, maybe you could say they're made of cows, and that's the really cool thing. So it seems purely dependent on your cultural upbringing on what you think is cool versus what you think is not cool. And so I don't think there's any correlation to this idea that this set of great making properties corresponds to reality as opposed to this set. It just seems to be like, we've made up these properties.
We're not talking about reality. So you're jumping ahead, I think, a little bit. So we're not talking about whether it corresponds to reality. All I'm talking about is what thing are we arguing about here that exists or doesn't exist? So, we've already said
if it exists, then it does relating to reality, right?
Well, right now we're just trying to figure out which thing we're talking about, like what thing it does. So let's suppose that, you say there is a Santa and I say there is no Santa. And then I say, wait, who said there is a Santa? You did. Okay. So then you tell me, yeah, Santa's this dude who lives down the street. He's really skinny, and blah, blah, blah. And I said, no, that's not what I mean by Santa. And you're like, well, I don't see why there's any properties which should belong to a Santa or whatever. It's like, well, yeah, but yeah, there's certain properties. If Santa exists, then what we're talking about when we say that is that there's this jolly guy living in the North Pole who flies around on a reindeer, driven sleigh, slave laborers, elves all day long, etc. So we're just talking about the concept. That's what the beginning step is. What is the concept of the thing which is in dispute? And the theist says the concept of the thing in dispute is the concept of a maximally great thing. That's what we're talking about.
Well, not exactly. So I'm talking about just the greatness. The greatness itself is the property I'm disputing, not the maximally great being, just the property of greatness itself. That is the property I'm disputing. I'm saying, well, where is this property? Because if this property doesn't exist in reality, then there's no maximally great being. Or if it does exist in reality but towards something else, then your idea of the maximally great being is wrong. So I'm not specifically disputing your concept of the maximally great being. I'm disputing what does great mean, and how do we determine one definition is more correct or less correct than another?
Yeah. So we we it's like saying, if you haven't ever seen, to me it sounds like what you're saying. I'm probably wrong, so tell me. But it sounds like what you're saying is, if you've never seen something which is literally infinite, then you don't understand what the infinite is. And so your definition of the infinite is no better than mine. To which I think, no, that's not true. I don't need to see something that's infinite in order to understand what this is a point that Hume made, by the way, in response to Descartes. He said, look, Descartes, because Descartes, part of Descartes' argument for the existence of God was sort of involving this idea that the concept of God is an infinite being. We can't get the concept of infinity from things which are finite. So therefore there must have been some sort of infinite cause, something which was itself infinite, which caused our concept. And Hume says that's silly, because here's the concept of the infinite, add one more and never be done. So we don't need to actually encounter something which itself is infinite to understand the concept of the infinite. And in reality, there doesn't need to be anything which is actually infinite. So this whole debate, there is actually a debate about whether there are such things as actual infinities. By the way, the theists hate actual infinities. I love them. I think they're all around us. So I don't find that to be very problematic, but that's a different question. So it sounds like that's what you're doing. You're saying, unless you can point to me that what this refers to, then the concept itself is up for debate.
Well, no. So my claim isn't specifically that you need to see one or have an empirical demonstration, but you do need some way to differentiate which of these definitions is more likely to correspond to reality than another. So arguments are perfectly fine. You could provide whatever method you want to do this, but you need some method that could differentiate which of these definitions of great are the more correct ones and the less correct ones. Because I say great is a square circle, and the square circle is the perfect greatness. You'd say, well, that's logically contradictory, so probably not. I'd be like, okay, maybe not. But so you'd have to give some way to differentiate the definitions and say this one is more likely to be correct or more reasonable in some sense than this other one. And without that, then they're just all equally as reasonable.
Yeah, but so why isn't a good answer that it's intuitively correct? That all-knowing, all-powerful, morally correct is better than being made of spaghetti.
Well, I'd say intuition has a defeater automatically. Our intuitions are wrong a lot. It was instantly defeated that our intuitions are
wrong. So do you think that because you have hallucinations and dreams that you don't trust perception? I mean, I don't think that's the way we respond to those sorts. So we can be wrong, sure. That doesn't mean that intuitions can't be, when carefully thought about, can't be, useful.
Sure.
So why isn't that a good response?
Well, intuition in combination with things like empirical verifiability or whatever, that's great evidence. I love that. Testimony, conceptual evidence, as I call it, the personal experience, intuitions, those kind of things are great in combination with something else that's a lot stronger, which is like empirical evidence. But on their own, they're kind of useless.
You're talking about something different now, because what we're talking about is just defining a concept, not knowing if it refers to anything or is fulfilled. So we don't need empirical evidence in order to think about the concept.
Oh yeah, sure. You can define a concept any way you want. I have equally as much right to define it differently, and there's no more. It's not more or less rational.
But that can't be right. Can't be right. Well, because there are many things like, so how, what's a good example here? That some things which intuition suggests can't be defined any way that you want. Let's say, so, I don't want to get in the context. Let's see, what's a good example? So take, I don't know, Euclid's proof that there is only one even prime number, that all prime numbers greater than 2 are odd. There's a nice proof of that, by the way. It's very, very, very simple, which is that if the number were even and greater than 2, then it would have factors of 2 and itself, and therefore not be prime. So there's an intuitive judgment about something which gives us some knowledge about infinitely many things, namely that out of all the numbers which exist, there's only one prime even number.
Sure, if you have a formal proof, you can just get rid of the intuition. I don't even care about the intuition. Just give me the formal proof, and then I'll admit that your definition is better.
I didn't give you a formal proof. I just gave you some intuition pump. I mean, I could give you the formal proof. I didn't do that. What I did, I did that on purpose. I didn't give a formal proof. All I did was say it's intuitively the case and I gave you a kind of example, and then you inferred from there We didn't do any kind of mathematical induction. There was no sort of formal, I mean, the proof involves a few steps or whatever. We didn't do that.
No, well, I don't share that intuition. I don't feel any intuition towards that whatsoever. I'm not sure what that means exactly to have an intuition towards that.
Towards what? Even prime.
Yeah, like there's a prime number, only one prime number that is non-divisible by other things or whatever. I don't know what that means. Yeah, I don't know what it means to have an intuition towards that. I don't relate. But so to try and think of a different example, like I have an intuition that killing babies is wrong, and I'm going to label that as, well, no, that's not, it's actually killing babies is right. I'm going to relabel that intuition or something. That's kind of like the point you're making, is that you can have some interpretations of intuitions could be wrong where others are right or something like that.
Yeah, well, so some intuitions clearly are wrong, I would say. Like the famous one from math is the parallel postulate. People thought that you should be able to deduce it from the other postulates. People thought intuitively this was the case, and they couldn't do it. And now we know that because of it, we have non-Euclidean geometries. So there was a case where people thought something intuitively was the case mathematically, and they were incorrect about that. So sometimes intuitions lead us astray, but that doesn't mean they always lead us astray. And intuitively, it just seems that it's better to be maximally great in the following way: all-knowing, all-powerful, morally good, perfect, than it is to be made of spaghetti. It doesn't seem like you need an argument to establish that one is better than the other, since it's sort of intuitively clear that one is better than the other.
Yeah, I don't share that intuition at all. Just like the math thing, like I feel no intuition towards this whatsoever. I would feel more the intuition that the naturalistic pantheism is greater because it's simpler. I think the simpler thing is greater, not the conscious thing is greater. Your definition of greater seems to be completely arbitrary. I don't see how this is rational at all.
The fact that you don't share the intuition doesn't mean that it isn't intuitively clear.
Sure, but I'm saying that intuitions themselves.
Colorblind, for example, doesn't mean there aren't colors, etc. So, so the fact that you don't find it intuitive, that's fine. Lots of people do, including myself. So, I guess I'd say you sound a little colorblind to me when you say those things, which isn't a bad thing. But it does seem like a defect in your intuitive ability rather than a defect in the intuition I have.
Well, no, I'd still say you need a way to show some intuitions are more reasonable than others. And if you don't have that, it's irrational to believe that your intuition on its own is correct.
Why? Lots of people share my intuition. Very few share yours. In fact, all the experts share my intuition in this case, and none share yours. By consensus, you're wrong.
I would have to look at the consensus and see that the case, because I haven't seen that at all.
But let's suppose hypothetically that it did turn out that the consensus was that this is intuitively the case.
I would take that as evidence for sure. I would say that, yeah, I've got to look into this more and see why do they have the consensus, because I'm going to find the evidence for it to see if I could understand this. But I don't think it's the case. But yeah, if you have the consensus, that's definitely something like, all right, that would probably be evidence. I'm going to look into that. But I don't think it's the case.
It is the case. Amongst the people who think about this is the consensus. They could be wrong. I'm not a big fan of the argument from consensus, but I do think that we should defer to people who know more about these things than we do. And if they, as a group, come to some judgment, then that's reason for us to take seriously the thing that they're saying. And so I think this is an example of that. And the consensus, you may not like the group of experts. It's going to be all a bunch of planting of people, and they're sycophants.
I would actually clarify this. So I would say experts in this would be philosophy, not just Thomists. I think Thomism itself isn't a qualified field of experts on metaphysics. They're not experts on metaphysics. They're experts on Thomism.
He's not a Thomist.
Or any Plantingaist. If philosophers of religion are not experts in anything other than religion, they're not experts in reality or metaphysics. So their ideas have no correspondence or relevance as authorities to anything in reality, only in religion. So I consider them experts. What?
In philosophy of religion.
Yeah. Well, lots of things in religion.
It's the same with every subdiscipline. So molecular biologists have expertise in molecular biology, but not in systems neuroscience, perhaps. And economists have expertise in whatever nonsense economists talk about. It's all made up bullshit, in my opinion. But anyway, whereas they might not have expertise in political theory. So it's the same here. Yep. Philosophy is not a single thing. There's no expert. I would dispute the idea that there is an expertise in philosophy simpliciter.
All right. So my question here is, if you're saying this concept of a greatest possible being is one that exists, we're going to look at the experts in metaphysics of the things and ontology of the things that exist. They're the ones who have a say here, not the philosophers of religion. Now, if I got a question about what Thomas Aquinas thought, I'm going to the philosophers of religion. They have the expertise. They're the correct ones to ask. If I want to know a question about what exists, they're not the ones to ask.
Yeah, but we're not talking about what exists. We're talking about whether it's better to be morally perfect, all-knowing, and all-powerful than it is to be made out of spaghetti. So we're not talking about whether something exists or not. We're just talking about the concept of what it means to be maximally great. And the people to talk to about that are probably the philosophers of religion.
Well, again, I would say that saying which definition is better is, again, that's totally arbitrary. You're just going based off of the language, just natural ambiguity of language. Go to the linguists and say, linguists, which is the better one? And they're the ones who would be the experts on the correct usage of the language, not the philosophy of religion.
Yeah, we're not talking about language, though. We're talking about the intuitive betterness of having these three properties that I've described.
Well, if we're talking about intuition, I'm going to go to the evolutionary biologist and say, well, what is the grounds of our intuitions on that basis? Again, I wouldn't say. So again, I don't think anything related to the ideas themselves have anything of any value to the conversation. So I don't know how the concept of maximally great being, like, again, I don't agree with your concept. If you want to define your concept away, that's perfectly fine. I don't think there's any justification for that at all, other than
there's a justification for
what?
The justification is intuition.
Right. I'm saying that's not. I don't even count that as a justification here. So if you want to have an intuition about a definition, I mean, that's fine. Okay, but that doesn't count as anything for me.
And the consensus is that this is the correct definition.
Not in overall philosophy, but if you want to take it in.
Well, actually, I'm not. It's not so clear that that's true.
Based off reading the criticisms of it, I think that it's rejected for many of the reasons of the criticisms provided against these ideas. I think the consensus is against it.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's the case. That's an empirical question, but even so, yeah. So, okay. Anyway, all right. Let's put a pin in that because I don't see any way past this without doing some surveys. By the way, they do these surveys. So there's the
Phil surveys paper.
Yeah, they're currently doing another version of it right now, so we should get some results at some point. And they don't ask this question, unfortunately. But even if so, even taking your view, I think that you have worked yourself into accepting my conclusion. Which is that if you accept this definition as intuitively reasonable, then it's rational for a person to believe that such a being exists via the ontological argument. So it may not be rational for you because you don't accept the intuitive correctness of the definition, but it is rational for Plantinga because he does.
Well, my objection would be the first part. Like, if you accept it's rational to accept this definition, I was like, well, there has to be a rational reason to accept this definition. Without it, it can't be rational just because of intuition.
Yeah, it can.
How so?
Well, how not?
There are lots of intuitions that are irrational. Such
as?
The intuition that space and time don't bend. The intuition about the math thing you mentioned. The intuition that any hallucination...
That is a reasonable thing to accept without further empirical refutation. Certainly it was rational for Newton to think that. Newton was not irrational because he thought there was absolute space and time. He just didn't have some empirical facts and the right math to analyze the situation. But I think it's a bit far too much to say Newton was irrational because he didn't accept that space and time bend.
Well, I'd say it's rational to accept intuitions as concepts. It's not rational to accept intuitions as something that corresponds to reality. If you want to say it's in reality, you need evidence from reality. Your intuition doesn't cut it.
Right. But so the first step is where you get the planting a point. So if it's rational for someone to accept this definition of a maximally great being, then it's rational for them to conclude from that the maximally great being exists because it's a necessary being. So for them, those who accept the definition, it's reasonable to conclude that the being exists. That doesn't establish that. So we're not talking about whether it really exists. Notice that's how at the beginning of this conversation, I stepped one back. I don't care about reality at this point. I'm just talking about whether it's reasonable or rational for a person to end up in this with this belief. And it seems like it is if you accept the starting point. And now you don't. So I understand why you think it's not rational for you to accept it. And this is kind of the whole problem with Bayesian shit, right? So all your priors change everything. So depending on what your priors are. So in this sense, the planting has a prior that you don't, or you have a prior that he doesn't, or whatever. But so you're going to end up from different conclusions than he does. But that doesn't mean that he's irrational for ending up where he does, because he accepts something that you don't. So therefore, it's reasonable for him to end up with that result, just like it was reasonable for Newton to end up where he did, because he accepted certain basic things and Einstein rejected those. And so it's not reasonable for Einstein, blah, blah. So I think that once you start asking questions about, isn't it rational for a person to accept something, it's a much weaker claim than, is the thing really there or not? No, I don't really, to me, it's, who cares if the thing's really there or not? We're just talking about, like, is it rational for a person to arrive at this belief? And I don't really see how you've challenged that for someone who does accept these kinds of definitions.
Okay, let me see if I can rephrase here. So I think that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, kind of a thing. So I think that rationality, for something to be rational, the claim has to be supported by equivalent evidence, essentially. So if you have a conceptual claim, I am imagining a unicorn, the conceptual evidence of my testimony, I'm just telling you I'm imagining a unicorn, is perfectly fine. It's perfectly rational to say that, yes, he is imagining a unicorn because he said he's imagining a unicorn. If I said I saw a unicorn, like a living, breathing, actual unicorn, and all you had is my testimony, well, the amount of evidence does not meet the level of the claim, so you would reject it as irrational. It would be irrational for me to believe that you actually saw a unicorn based off of your testimony. But if you could provide like empirical evidence, like the DNA of it or something that I could, or the fossils of the unicorn, then yeah, then it would be rational. So the proportion of evidence must meet the proportion of the claim. So if all your claim is that you like this definition, yeah, that's rational. I can rationally accept that you have this claim that you think this is the best definition of the greatest possible being in your imagination. Granted. But if you go one further, that based off of your intuitive definition that this thing exists, that can't follow. That can never be rational.
Agreed, but that's not the point. The point is that based on that definition, you conclude that I believe that there is such a thing.
That exists outside of your imagination.
Yeah, you believe it, but you're not claiming that it is there. So it's okay for me to believe that this is the case based on the definition, whether it is or not. So evidence is tricky this way. You can have evidence for things that are false, obviously. So there was lots of evidence that the Earth was stationary. I think we even still have that evidence currently. It's just overridden by a lot of other better evidence. But I still currently, you tell me I'm fucking moving? Like what? Come on, dude. I'm sitting right here. So that's evidence. It can be defeated. And it has been defeated, like, conclusively, in my opinion. Although actually it's a little bit tricky, because once you get Einstein in the picture, it's like, okay, Einstein, this is not kind of a tangent, but Einstein claims that it's equally appropriate to say that we're stationary and the sun is moving as it is to say that the sun is moving and we're stationary, or vice versa. So I don't know, are we really in motion? If everything is relative, then, maybe we aren't, blah, blah, blah. Okay, anyway, so that's a technicality from physics. I think the first person I heard make that point, actually, a guy named Hans Halvorsen.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, he's a philosopher. He's a theist philosopher of religion. Anyway, so I think that's a serious point, actually. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I forgot what I was saying.
So you said that they believe this being exists based off of their intuitive definition. So yeah, let me just finish that. So with respect to the unicorn, if I had an experience of a unicorn, then certainly I would be rational to believe that I saw a unicorn. You might not be rational to accept it, but I had the experience. Well, I would reject it. I'd say if I had experience of a unicorn, I would definitely not be rational to believe it existed.
But of course you would. I mean, if you really thought that, then a lot of science would be thrown out the window, since for the most famous example is the black swan. So if the guys who went to Australia the first time and saw the first black swan had the attitude that you have, they would say, that can't be a black swan. We already know all swans are white. What the hell, dude? Come on, bro. You're not rational. You're not really seeing that. And of course, now I know you're going to say, well, they followed up with a bunch of experiments or whatever and chopped up the poor guy and analyzed the DNA. But even if they hadn't done that, it still would have been rational for them to accept that they had seen a black swan and that this would give them some reason to think that not all swans are white.
Well, I'd say like, if it was one guy who saw a black swan, like, no, you'd be like, I gotta go catch it and show it to other people. Then it would be reasonable. But I don't like people who see Bigfoot in the woods. I don't think they're rational to believe in Bigfoot. So I think
why not? You don't believe personal experience can provide justification to believe things?
Depends on the kind of claim. So there's for some things, yes, I saw a dog. Yes, I saw a unicorn. No, I think that for things that have an empirical basis and can be verified independently of your personal experience, yes. For things that can't, no. So in the case of like the Bigfoot example, I think it's far more likely, because personal experience and intuition have inherent defeaters because we know how flawed they are and they're wrong most of the time, that you would conclude that just probabilistically they're wrong and it's irrational to believe them just on the fact that you've had them until you have that further demonstration independent of your personal experience.
Yeah, I guess that's if that's a consequence of your epistemology, it seems overly restrictive. Seems like if you told that to me, I'd be like, look, buddy, I know what I saw. You don't fucking tell me shit. I saw it. I know what I saw. Now, I'd be open to the idea maybe I was wrong. And certainly I would want to look further into it. But I don't think you could come along and say, I mean, I know what you're doing. You're doing kind of the Hume argument against miracle things, right? So, the irregularity of nature is too established. So any sort of thing that falls out of that, we should be skeptical of, and no amount of people saying this.
No, I would reject that. So I don't go with Hume here. So again, my claim is that it has a defeater. So like if you see an optical illusion, if every human being sees an optical illusion, we can say, no, it is not moving. We can prove it's not moving. You're wrong. And since we have lots and lots of different examples of these things where we know it's wrong, we could say, well, is it possible that what you saw is one of this tens of thousands of lists of things we know is wrong? And the answer is yes. We know it could fit into many of these different things. And we know these exist. We already have lots and lots of evidence that these things exist in reality. We don't have any evidence independent of your personal experience that thing exists. So it's always going to be more reasonable for both us and you to believe it's one of these and not one of those. So I don't, based off of what you said, I think that would make it reasonable for every person who's seen a UFO to conclude there are UFOs, and every person who's seen Bigfoot to be reasonable to believe it's Bigfoot, and every person who saw the Loch Ness Monster be reasonable to believe in the Loch Ness Monster, and miracles and magic and homeopathy. And I don't think that's correct. I think that's obviously incorrect.
But it seems obviously correct to me. If you see the Loch Ness Monster, that is some reason to believe in the Loch Ness Monster. In fact, I mean, I heard you say something like this once before, I guess. So this is one of the differences between like how, because I watched an interview with you that you just did recently, actually, which I thought was very interesting on that Simple Blasphemy show. I thought it was a pretty cool interview. But anyway, so you were talking about your personal experience growing up, being raised in a religious household, and you were praying all the time and nobody answered your prayers and you became disillusioned. And, you know, so I've never actually prayed before. They tried to force me, but I always couldn't do it. Like I was like, this is bullshit. So I have never sincerely done that, to be honest with you. But for me, the issue wasn't like no one answered me back. It was more like the very ideas or concepts that they're telling me don't make sense. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point, though, is that by your own, what you just said, if you had been answered, that wouldn't count as evidence that there were a God. You should still be an atheist. Even if you had prayed and God came down and said, poof, no fucking depression, then you should conclude, no, probably my serotonin did something and blah, 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 and I'm hallucinating and I reject. So
yes, that is correct.
Okay, so you agree then. But I thought I've heard you say before that evidence, if there were evidence for a existence of God, it would be this answering prayer bullshit. If you said, oh, that there'd be a sandwich and a sandwich showed up, then that would count as evidence for the God. But now what you're saying is, no, that wouldn't count as evidence for a God. So I'm a bit.
So novel future testable predictions would be evidence for God. So if I like prayed for things I can't control and they happen at a regular interval at higher percentage chance, yep, that's evidence. My personal experience, like curing depression or something, if that worked at a higher rate than chance, yes, that would be evidence. And if God answered any of my prayers, I would still be a Christian, but I wouldn't be reasonable for it. Just because it worked. That's so there's
Oh, so
two
you
separate
agree it
things.
wouldn't be rational
Yeah,
to.
yeah. So if you got to answer my prayers, I would still be a Christian, but it would not have been rational because my prayers weren't like made on future testable prediction basis.
Right.
So, but if you did make prayers on a future testable prediction basis, those would be rational.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting because you totally reject the argument from personal experience at all. Like, here I am minding my own business. God shows up and says, "Hey, sinner, dipshit, fucking change your ways." And I go, "Oh my gosh, I gotta fucking get my shit together over here." And you're saying, then you come along and say, "No, that's irrational."
Yes, I would
You don't have any
absolutely.
reason.
Absolutely. I would
Really?
say that's irrational. I would say for that to be rational, you'd have to go an extra step. So you'd say, you saw God. It's like, so God, I see you, but you could be a delusion. So you got to do the Scrooge thing. All right. So if you're real, show me this, do this test for me and we'll
Oh,
find
you're
out.
doubting Thomas, motherfucker. Okay. I get
Absolutely.
it.
Thomas was the reasonable one. Let me remind you.
Yes, he was the reasonable one. Exactly. Stick the hole through the finger. Come here over here. Yeah. Okay. So I guess I have a more, to me, it seems, and this may be, planting has a, remember, I'm not a theist. Don't put me in that camp.
What? You're not a Hare Krishna? Ah.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not a Hare Krishna. I have friends who are Hare Krishna, actually. I had a good friend I used to play music with who was Hare Krishna. Anyway, who cares? The point, though, is, yeah, because I do think that personal experience would give, if that happened to me, I would say I personally have reason to believe in these things. Not you, but it seems to me like, yeah, that I mean, because I know what you're saying. I remember I debated this one guy once and over the problem of evil stuff. And he was telling me he had this experience and he just had this, it felt like connected to the universe and at one with everything. And I was like, yeah, I've done ecstasy too, dude. Like, we all get that. And yeah, that's not a reason for me to accept, but for him, I mean, the only reason I'm believing anything right now is like, here I can touch things and so forth. I have risk. So it seems like, yeah, personal experience to me seems like it does justify. If it only happens once in a room by yourself, and I did talk to a guy one time. He's like, every time I'm in a room by myself, I roll the dice. It always comes up 6. But every time someone looks, it never does that. Okay, so that's not a reason for me to accept it. But I don't know. Statistically, that is interesting if that happens to you. So,
what would you say that was
a more relaxed view about it? So I think your standards of rationality are too high. Most of the things we believe are irrational by these standards.
Well, do you think that guy, the dice guy, would be reasonable to believe that they actually do roll 6s, or do you think it would be more reasonable for him to believe that I'm probably having a delusion? There's got to be something wrong here. Which of those would be more rational?
Honestly, it depends on a bunch of background beliefs, I think, about the way the world works and what's going on. Yeah. So
Given most of our understanding of modern science and
personally
neurology.
would go with he's delusional. He's a nice guy, by the way. I hope he's not watching. He's kind of almost a well-known person, so I shouldn't be talking too much. But anyway, actually, he said this on a podcast. I mean, he's an author, a well-known science fiction author. I don't know how well-known anyway. Anyway, he wrote some pretty cool books. But yeah, I guess I would go with the he's delusional. But personally, that's because I have a lot of background beliefs about how unspecial nature is and non-magical and stuff like that. But if you had a bunch of different background beliefs, then I think that's the problem with this whole rationality business. It depends on so that's the Bayesian point I was talking about earlier. It depends what your priors are, like what level, and you can adjust those. And so people will start with the same evidence and come to different conclusions based on these antecedent assumptions about the nature of the world. And what you're saying, I guess, is that some of these priors are more reasonable than others. And there, I guess, I don't really see.
I could partially agree with your point there for sure. So I could say that, like, if I'm a 5-year-old kid and I don't have access to modern science and all I really know about is a very limited spectrum of epistemological means to gain knowledge, and my parents tell me Santa Claus exists, and so the most reliable source of information I have right now tells me that there's this guy who comes down the chimney and puts presents there, then that person may be justifiably rational in their worldview to conclude Santa Claus exists.
The 5-year-old,
yeah. So when I say rational, I'm talking about given modern science, what we know with the highest level of rationality we have, the consensus of experts of all the major scientific fields, would this belief be rational? And my answer would be no. It would not be rational to believe the dice has come out six every time you see it, or if you saw God personally, that there was really a God there. Given our current understanding of science, there are defeaters for these beliefs. Now, of course, if you didn't have that, you were just a pygmy in Africa or whatever, then maybe for that person it could be rational, but that is a different topic. That's the levels of rationality proportional to the amount of evidence you have. And so when I'm asking, is it rational to believe, I'm always putting it in the context of modern science. Given our modern understanding of the world, would it be rational?
Yeah, I'm not sure why you think modern science has anything to say about the dice, since it certainly is not against the laws of probability that it comes up six every time you roll the dice.
Oh yeah, I would say that we have lots and lots of examples of things that this could be explained, that we already have evidence exists, like hallucination, delusion, misconception, all these things, selection bias, all kinds of things that we know exist. There's millions of examples of these occurring in the world. So if you're going to say, I saw this occur, and there's this new phenomenon we haven't discovered yet, or it's one of the old phenomena that can explain the exact same things with no added difficulty, it's probably one of those. Like if you saw Bigfoot, it could have been just a bear, a thin bear. That's more likely. So it's always more reasonable to go with
a thin bear.
A thin bear. One of the thousands of things we already have evidence for that have already been demonstrated that can explain everything about the phenomenon, rather than to say there is this new phenomenon.
I mean, the problem with that for me is that if you say it's probably a thin bear, then that means also logically that it probably isn't.
What?
If it's probably A, then it's equally, I mean, depending on the math here, it's probably not A as well, since it's only probably A.
Right. So it's probability, like probably would be greater than 50% chance, essentially, or the highest percent chance given the possibilities.
Yeah. So, okay. It's probably, yeah. How do you think about this here? So, if I see something that's outside of the realm of science, I mean, I've had weird experiences before. I've done taken mushrooms and had all sorts of weird delusions about the nature of the universe and universal consciousness. And then I came out of it and I was like, whoa, that was weird. But it didn't convert me to being a non-materialist, in fact. And some people do say, I've heard this before. Oh, you materialists, just take some fucking DMT and you'll see. And I was like, what I have. And it didn't affect me. I mean, I did see all kinds of stuff and it felt certain ways, but after I came to my senses, I was like, yeah, I was on drugs. So it doesn't seem to me that, so that was because my background, right? Because this is sort of where I was going with this. So I had this idea that everything was one and universally connected and we're not different when I was on these drugs. And then I woke and then I came down from them, but my background beliefs that nature isn't like that overruled it. And I was like, no, that was just a weird experience. My brain was generating these things in a certain way and blah, blah. And I would tell all sorts of stories about what parts of the brain were doing that. And the same is true with like near-death experiences and all that, right? So you can say, oh, well, there's just a part of the brain, this is what happens, blah, blah, blah. But my background beliefs about the nature of science came in and overruled that. But if I had different background beliefs, I think I would have concluded from those sorts of experiences that maybe there was, idealism was true, or that there is a universal consciousness or something like that. So the background beliefs, I think, are important here. That's the point that we've been talking about. And it doesn't seem like it's unreasonable for a person to think, well, this world is so wonderful and magical, and so science can't explain everything. And so these experiences I have that seem at odds with science must be indicating something unique or special. That doesn't seem like an irrational attitude. It's not my attitude, but it doesn't seem irrational.
It seems an awful lot like an argument from ignorance fallacy, which I would definitely consider to be irrational.
It's not an argument. Well, how is it argument from ignorance fallacy?
Science can't explain it.
The way I understand that is that no one's ever proven this, so therefore,
yeah. So science has never proven this. So that's evidence of my hypothesis.
No, that's not. So I see what you're doing there. Yeah, I don't think that's what I was suggesting. What I was suggesting was that the attitude that you're having sounds a little bit like the view called scientism, which is that science is the only way of knowing, or the best way of knowing, and that if there isn't a scientific way of knowing it, then we don't really know it. I kind of am sympathetic to scientism, honestly, but lots of people aren't, and they think it goes too far. And I don't think that's an unreasonable view. So it sounds like to me what you're saying is it is an unreasonable view.
Oh, no, because this isn't a claim about knowledge. It's a claim about rationality and justification. So I can say the person who believes that it was a supernatural being, they could be correct. They could have knowledge, absolutely. Like, science could just be wrong. Like, as you mentioned earlier, there can be evidence of false things, for sure.
Yeah.
But what I consider to be rational is accepting the biases or the prior beliefs of the strongest evidence we have so far. I think that is the rational thing to do. And it is not rational to do the other things, even though the other things could definitely lead to knowledge.
Why isn't it rational to do like a meta induction over the history of science and then conclude that probably our scientific understanding of the world is impoverished and that there's more to the world than we understand at the current moment?
No, that would be completely rational, but it would be irrational to go to that and say, well, my hypothesis. That's the part where that would be the irrational part. You could say science doesn't know everything. This could be an unexplained phenomenon. Perfectly rational. To say the unexplained phenomenon is a UFO, or it's the Neil deGrasse Tyson quote, "I saw a UFO. It must be aliens." Like, no, it's unidentified. You can't then identify it as something. So if you want to say there's this phenomenon I had, so there's this phenomenon I experienced, and this phenomenon may not be able to be explained by science. And then you can fully stop there. That is perfectly rational. There's nothing irrational about that. But then to say, then it's this, which I imagine it to be, that would be the irrational part.
Yeah, I don't see it. I don't see it. What's irrational about it? So if you think there's more to the world than what we can understand scientifically at the moment, and you have a certain sort of experience which doesn't fit in with what we scientifically understand, then I don't see why it's irrational to say, and no, notice it's not, I'm saying, so we're not saying I'm correct. We're talking about what we believe, not what is actually the case. So, if I believe that science is incomplete and doesn't tell us everything about the nature of the world, and then I have this experience, I see Bigfoot over there and he's like, yo, what's up? And I'm like, whoa, Bigfoot. And then you come and tell me, oh, that's at odds with science. And I go, well, why should we think that science knows everything? And you say, that's irrational. You should accept science. I don't see why you get to say that to me at that point.
Well, if it was a phenomenon that's already been explained by science and science has a good reliability on this phenomenon and you want to go against that, that would be irrational. If it's something science says nothing about, like that we have no evidence on whatsoever, then it's completely rational to be agnostic. But if it's something that we do have very good evidence that explains this already and it's extremely reliable, like the dice rolling is probably a hallucination or a delusion of some kind, then it's far more reasonable to go with the thing we already have a substantial amount of evidence that shows these occur than to disagree with the substantial amount of evidence. Now, of course, if you're right, if there's no evidence on some phenomenon, we have nothing, it's completely agnostic on it, then you're right, it would be completely, my position would be wrong. You can't go with science because science has nothing to say on this topic. But if science does have a lot to say on this topic and has been right a lot on this topic, and you're trying to go against all of that, that's where it's irrational.
So how has science had a lot to say and been right on the topic of whether or not a given person's personal experience of a religious experience? How has science rebutted that claim that, I've never had one of these real, well, I mean, close on drugs, I've had close things, but I've never had, my mom personally has, by the way. So I told you I was coming from a religious house, and, my mom says she's encountered demons, and she used to say weird shit to me too. Like, she saw demons watching over me in my sleep. Like, she'd tell me that when I wake up, and she'd be like, there was a demon standing at the foot of my bed. Like, and she was scared to come into my room because the demon was there. And I was like, fuck, well, all right. I didn't see it, but she claims that she experienced that she saw that. And I always thought, yeah, you're dreaming, or you're, I don't want to insult my mom too much, but you're a little bit wacko or whatever. But I never took that seriously. But for her, how could she not take that seriously? What is she supposed to say? She's supposed to say, I saw the demon standing at the foot of your bed. But science. So probably I didn't see it. I mean, it doesn't see it. That's not how we treat our experience, I guess. It seems I would say it was reasonable for her. It's having those experiences to conclude that what she did, which is that, I'm super awesome and devil loves me.
Well, yeah, I'd say that we have significant background knowledge on science for those things, specifically from epileptics and other kinds of neurological conditions where people see demons all the time, and we can literally stop them from seeing demons by shocking their brain in the right place. So it's far more
Yeah,
reasonable.
but how does that do anything for you? Because, I can shock your brain right now and stop you from seeing the screen in front of you. That doesn't mean the screen's not there. It just means I fucked with the part of your brain which is receptive to it. So why can't you give the same answer here?
Because other people can independently verify the screen in lots of different ways, testable predictions that have been confirmed over thousands of years, all kinds of ways, other than just independently of my personal experience. So if it can be confirmed independently of the personal experience, then it has that second level of evidence, which makes it reasonable to believe. Like when I say I saw a dog, there's lots of independent ways to verify dogs. If I never existed, you can still verify dogs. Not the case for the demons. If the only way for me to know if the demons is from your testimony or from your mom's testimony or from my personal experience, and there's no way to independently verify it, not reasonable. But if there's lots of independent ways,
really too strong though. So if let's suppose that I raised you in a room. Suppose you're just in this chair right here for your whole life, and you've never been out of it.
God, how did you know my secret?
Exactly. Kept you in my basement for many years. Oh, no, just kidding. So suppose that you were raised in this impoverished condition, and then I sneak in at night and TMS your visual cortex, the transcranial magnetic stimulation. So I zap you. You lose the visual experience of the chair, and then you suddenly say to me, "The chair doesn't exist. I've been hallucinating this whole time." You don't know anything about science. I've kept you in a room. I've zapped your brain without you even knowing it. I mean, most people don't even know they have a fucking brain. When I told because I study neuroscience, obviously, I told my mom about neurons, and she was like, she's a 50-year-old woman, and she was like, whoa, there are these things in my head called neurons. It's like, we don't know that. Or it's like, okay, so it's not how it seems. I know I stopped bashing my mom. I like my mom. We've reconciled over the years with this religion shit. But anyway, so the point is that I don't think it would be irrational for you to think that a chair was there still, even if I did this to you and didn't know anything about science.
Right. Like I said, if you have an impoverished view of epistemology and you don't have access to all science, lots of things would be more reasonable than they would be today. So like the kid believing Santa is perfectly rational because that's all he has access to. So rationality for me, when I'm talking about what is rational, I'm talking about the modern standard of science. What would be rational in that context? Since we do have lots of background information.
Science doesn't tell us anything about this.
About chairs?
That's the point I'm making.
About chairs?
About whether or not epileptic seizures in the temporal lobe, which some people think Joan of Arc was a victim of. It's known that you can have sort of out-of-body religious experiences by messing with that part of the brain. So it's not clear that science tells us that those are hallucinations as opposed to veridical perceptions. Science doesn't make a pronouncement on that. That's not its job.
Pretty sure the consensus is that those are literally hallucinations.
Yes, but you said that it conflicts with science, not the consensus. There's no scientific finding which shows that these things might not be actual veridical perceptions of an afterlife or a spiritual reality.
I'm not sure what you mean here, because the consensus is essentially science. Science is, it's not just the papers. There has to be people to interpret the papers who have a background knowledge to understand whether or not they actually count as evidence in what they're saying. But usually the pinnacle of science is the consensus, not the papers. But in my view, the models of neurology that have started with the brain is purely material. If the brain is purely material, we can make this prediction, do X, Y, and Z, get the correct results. And we've made predictions specifically about these kinds of visions, or we can turn them on or turn them off in specific parts of the brain where we made the hypothesis. If the brain is physical, these visions do not occur, we can stimulate them in this way to get rid of or stimulate these results in such a way. Those have produced successful predictions that have been confirmed in a lab, which then supports the hypothesis they are purely delusional. And so
why?
Because that was the hypothesis made to make the predictions.
It wasn't. The hypothesis was stimulating this part of the brain produces that experience, and that's been verified.
Yeah. So the hypothesis was that experience
was not, but the prediction was not stimulate this part of the brain, produce a delusion. That wasn't the prediction. The prediction was stimulate this part of the brain, produce an experience.
So the same thing applies in context of seeing things that we can demonstrably show don't exist. So like we can generate the experience that you're seeing a dead loved one, or that's a common thing, the bereavement delusion. We can cause these experiences, which we know for certain are definitely illusory, or things about.
We don't.
for like physical world stuff, like the TV is levitating. We can demonstrate it's not levitating. We can demonstrate they're having the experience of it levitating. We can show it's a part of their brain that's doing this that we can turn on or off. And so the same thing that applies to literal things that we can demonstrate are definitely illusory also apply to the things that we can't directly demonstrate are illusory. That's perfectly reasonable. That's why the consensus shows it's purely illusory. So,
yeah, I don't think that's right, because there's two different sorts of claims which are being made here. One is so the TV levitating example is susceptible to empirical confirmation. The dead relative one is not. So they are distinct, because one is a claim about physical reality and the other is a claim about a kind of non-physical or spiritual reality. And so empirical evidence wouldn't really count. So if you stimulate my brain and I see my dead grandmother there, and then you say that's the same as seeing the levitating TV, I think the onus is on you to establish the equivalency there, because they don't seem equivalent to me.
well, if the same part of the brain under the same model of neurology, it causes the exact same kinds of phenomenon, then it's reasonable to conclude that they are caused and by the exact same thing in the brain. So if the delusions of seeing the TV appear, or the delusions of optical illusions or hallucinations are caused, or the demonstrably false ones are caused by a specific part of the brain or whatever, and the ones that we can't demonstrably prove false are caused by the exact same part of the brain, and both can be turned on or off with the exact same feature in the brain, then it's reasonable to conclude they are the same thing.
Yeah, except for that you can also produce veridical experiences by doing that as well. So you can also stimulate the brain and come to have a perception of the TV in its correct and accurate location and position. And so you can't tell the difference between the veridical ones and the non-veridical ones simply by saying to me that you can produce the experience.
Right. So that would be the same thing, is that you would then have the burden of proof to show that this experience you had isn't one of the imaginary ones, because clearly that's one of the prominent possibilities there. So you would need some independent way other than your personal experience to verify that it's one of the real ones, not one of the imaginary ones. Because if you can't differentiate the real ones and imaginary ones, it's most likely imaginary.
Well, you haven't established that. Because the claim is that I'm seeing something which is not empirically verifiable. It's a separate kind of thing. It's like, a spiritual thing, a non-physical thing. And I don't need, so I already gave you the evidence that, remember, I'm not defending this. I'm seriously, we're just
for the sake of the argument.
The line of the argument. Yeah. I don't want people to come on here and start, I'm going to become known as Theist Brown. I don't want that to happen. So
we're going to give you like a tinfoil hat that you can wear while you're like,
yeah, exactly. Where's my tinfoil hat? Yeah. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe in QAnon, none of that shit. Okay. So,
So let me see if I can.
If I stimulate your brain, so I know you have. So this example's not going to work because you have weird ideas about abstract objects. You think they don't exist, which sounds to me like a contradiction. But what you mean
don't exist independent of the brain.
They don't exist independently of the brain. Yeah, that may be true. Maybe that isn't true. I don't know. But there's nothing contradictory, absurd in the notion that the number 2 is a non-physical abstract object that exists independently of the brain. There's nothing. So I don't really think we're forced to accept your view about that. But anyway, certainly I'm, like a nominalist, and I accept those sorts of things. But I don't think there's any real compelling reason to think that, as a matter of fact. So I don't know what your argument for that is. But anyway, so if I stimulate your brain and you have the experience of like grasping Cantor's diagonalization proof about the levels of infinity, and then I stimulate a different area in your brain and you have the experience of thinking of the highest number, then those are both about abstract things. One of them is veridical, one of them is not. So, and those you don't need empirical evidence to differentiate the two.
What do you mean? So I'm not following.
Well, there's no experiment which you can do to prove that Cantor was right or wrong. It's conceptual. It's mathematical. So that's you don't say it's up to you to go bring me the physical evidence of it. Because the kind of thing that we are talking about is not the sort of thing which can be given physical evidence for.
So the claim is that Cantor's proof is true, or that Cantor's proof exists independent of the mind?
The claim is that I stimulate your brain and you come to grasp it, understand it, and see that it's true.
Oh, so not like grasp as in like hold. I thought I was.
No, like in the intellectual sense of understand. Because some people don't understand. I mean, I try to teach this to students, and sometimes you're just like, I don't get it. Like, so you say you take these, but I mean, I assume you understand, this.
Cantor's diagonal proof are the ones where the numbers that on the diagonal are going to not correlate with any of the numbers on the line.
Yeah, and then you add that to the list, and then people say, well, so why does that prove anything? And
it's a bigger number than the infinity, so there's two different sizes of infinity. That's the whole point.
But the whole point of Cantor's proof is you don't write down an infinity. You write down a finite sequence, and then show that you can add something to it. And then the intuition is supposed to be, well, you can always do that. So there's no way that it's going to come to an end. But some people just don't get it. Like you tell them this, and then they're just like, I don't get it. And then you say, well, the natural numbers are of one size, they're infinite, and the rational numbers are another size, they're both infinite, but they're different sizes. And then you show them the proof, and they're like, fuck you, like, what are you talking about? So some people just don't get it. So then you take them into the lab, you stimulate their brain, and they go, oh, aha, now I get it. There's different sizes of infinity. And then you take the same person into the lab and you stimulate their brain, and they go, oh, aha, the biggest number is, and they tell you a number. One of them is veridical, correct. The other is incorrect, but there's no physical, empirical thing which you can bring to the person and say, here's what's going on. And what I'm suggesting is that it's similar to the difference between the TV levitating and the dead grandma. One requires physical evidence. The other is not a claim about physical reality. It's a claim about non-physical reality. It's a claim about different subject.
Right. So the way I would classify those is purely conceptual truth. So I'm not a empiricist in the fact that all knowledge is empirical. I think there is conceptual knowledge, things that we can know by thinking about it. And I'd say that those things don't require empirical evidence. You can just know them by thinking about it, and that's perfectly fine as a rational justification.
Right.
And I'm totally fine with those being justifications for the Cantor's diagonal proof in math and logic and those kinds of things. But I think the class that there is this something exists independent of my imagination is a different level of evidence, or a different level of a claim that requires a different level of evidence than just I can think about it. So,
but hold on. The claim is that's true for empirical truths, and the point that I'm making is not claim for other kinds of truths. That's the whole point that I'm trying to, that's the analogy with the Cantor thing. So you have that view about what mathematical truths are. Someone else might be a Platonist, and I don't think it's irrational to be a Platonist. I don't accept Platonism, that there are non-physical abstract objects that are eternal, unchanging, exist outside of space and time, that somehow the mind comes in contact with. I don't accept that view, but I don't think it's irrational to hold that view. So someone who did have that view and came to understand Cantor's proof would think that they came to understood something about non-physical reality. And then if you said, show me where in physical reality this thing exists, they would say, but I'm not making a claim about physical reality. This is a claim about mathematical reality. And you say, I don't think there is any such thing. And they say, yeah, but I just came in contact with it. I bumped into it. I mean, go and read someone like Gödel. You get the feeling like these guys are like interacting with more than their definitions. I mean, I saw that discussion, by the way, that guy's really annoying, but I saw that discussion with that physicist you had. I think he's incorrect about what he said about Gödel's theory, actually, or theorem. It's showing that there's mathematics can't be definitional in the way that you think or Hume thinks or something like that. But anyway, that's a separate point. The point is that if they say, I came to see the reality of this mathematical realm, I mean, I don't know, look at forcing and the continuum hypothesis. These things seem like more than mere definitions. These guys are talking about things which they have a grasp of. They're climbing around on them. There's like a structure there that's real to them, which I could only see through a kind of foggy veil. But to them, it's like there, and they're climbing around in the nooks and crannies of ZFC, right? So the
Zermelo Frankel, something.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so I don't think that you would be justified to come to them and say, if they had this experience, that they needed to show you some empirical proof of it, because they're not making a claim about the empirical world, the natural world. They're making a claim about the supernatural world, or not. I mean, not supernatural. That's pejorative in mathematical sense. But anyway, the non-natural. That's not even true. The non-physical. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I use supernatural synonymous with all those. I'm fine with that. Makes sense. But
yeah,
yes, I would agree. I would agree. I would say that yes, you can have rational belief that there is like a platonic number or something, and you can definitely have rational belief of certain kinds of platonic things. But I don't think you can have a rational belief that anything is platonic. I can't like hold up this cup and say this is a platonic cup. I've met this platonic cup in the platonic realm. Like the cup is there. It has a specific size, a direction, a shape, and you're saying that's platonic. That is irrational. And so if you're saying there is a thing that is there and it has this shape and this size and reflects light in this way, or appears to, it's because it isn't empirical in some way, then you're saying that there is a thing that is in the physical world in that location that is interacting or doing something there in relation to some other thing. This is an empirical thing. Like you're saying this exists independent of your mind. So if you're saying that your mind has access to this platonic realm and there's this platonic realm somewhere and you can feel it, okay, that's fine. But if you're saying that cup exists in the platonic realm and it's there in the real realm, well, now your claim is of the kind that I'm talking about. It has
right.
something to do with this external world. And so if you're claiming that there's this spirit or a demon that is there in the external world, then I think it does put it in the same category that we're talking about these things that exist independent of the mind. And so it does try to elevate your claim that it has to have some relation in that same sense.
Yeah, I guess there's a part of me that agrees with that, but to be the kind of person I'm imagining is saying, look, the world is more complex than we think that it is. There are these physical things, and then there are these non-physical things, and they can both appear to us in various ways. So they're not saying that there's a physical object over there which has these properties. What they're saying is there's some kind of non-physical thing which is manifesting itself in a certain way. I mean, I don't know. When who was it, Peter or Paul or whichever disciple dude was walking down the Damascus road, and the angel came and said, "Repent, sinner, fucking asshole," and he was like, "Ah." I don't think that they think that there was a physical object in front of them. I think that what they think is that, these things somehow cause the experience, or this is the way that they interact with us or something like that. And yeah, they have to do that through the brain because we're physical objects. So how else are they going to do it? Like they've got to work through the brain. So they've got to cause something to happen in the brain in order for you to experience their presence. So it doesn't seem all that surprising that, yeah, we could produce that same kind of experience by interacting with the brain as well. But it doesn't seem like it puts it in the realm that you're demanding that it be put in the realm of. Now, certainly I agree that, if I say the number 2 is over there and I can bump into it, that's a different claim. But saying that I come to interact with the number 2 by proxy by looking at these 2 cups is a different claim, right? Because you're saying you're interacting with that thing as a way to get at the other thing. So I don't think that it does automatically put it in the realm that you're saying that it does. It's not an empirical claim simply because you're saying it appears a certain way and that it's over there as opposed to over here, because you can kind of invoke the Kantian claim. That's the only way we can experience things. The only possible way we can experience anything is as located in a certain position and place, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, of course, an angel is going to appear that way. That doesn't mean that they are physical or that they are subject to the same sorts of demands.
Sure, but I still think there's a limit to the kinds of things you can reasonably claim are of that realm. Like you couldn't claim, there are certain things you cannot claim is in this other realm because it doesn't make sense. So you can't claim there's a square circle in this realm.
Right.
Maybe you could, or you could, there's a round square platonic object or something. I would consider that to be irrational. Or if you say there is a cup that is a platonic object, I'm like, so that's irrational. I don't think that makes sense. So there's certain kinds of things that are rational to claim are platonic objects, irrational to claim that are platonic objects, and things that are probably in the middle ground that are like may or may not be, we don't know. And I think that unless you can show it's in the rational to claim it's a platonic object realm, then it's not rational to claim it's a platonic object.
Right.
And so I'd say that this idea that there is this, like the ontological greatest possible being thing, I'd put that in the gray area where it could be, maybe, may not be. And I don't see any reason to say it's in the rational one, whereas numbers definitely in the rational one, cups irrational one, square circles irrational one. So I think that because you can't show it's in the rational realm, it's not rational to conclude it is a thing there in that other realm.
Why is it not rational to conclude that the maximally great being is non-physical?
Non-physical. I think non-physical is fine, but I'm saying the quality of greatness itself, is that one of the Platonic objects or an object?
Yeah, I guess I'm getting a little bit lost on the dialectic here, so it's probably my fault. I have had a bit of a migraine today, so maybe I'm a bit slower than normal. But uh, so to back up a little bit, the kind of point that I was trying to make was that I don't. So what started all this, besides the ontological argument, was this idea that there's something conflicting with science in these kind of reports about spiritual experiences. That if I have an experience as of a demon or a god revealing something, coming down and telling me something, you were saying we have lots of reason to believe that these are merely delusional beliefs. I don't think it's right to call the experiences delusional, because I think the word delusion means belief that resists evidence, even lots of evidence. So, when I think of delusions, I think of like Cotard's delusion, the belief that I'm dead. And there's people that go around and say that they're like, I'm dead, I'm rotting inside, but you're fucking eating a taco, dude. Like you dead people don't eat tacos and get hungry. But anyway, so they're like, I'm filled with maggots and I'm dead. And you show them lots of evidence that that's not the case. You take an x-ray, no maggots, and like, no, there's maggots in there. I'm dead, I'm rotting. So when I think of delusions, I think of beliefs that resist lots of evidence. I think Cotard's delusion actually come from other people too, right? People think my wife is dead. She's been replaced by a duplicate. So those are beliefs, not experiences. In fact, there's a whole debate in the philosophy of psychiatry about whether delusional beliefs are rational or not. So in fact, in the background of that debate, some people, including myself, I guess I'd be sympathetic to this view, is that the delusional beliefs are based on weird anomalous experiences that they have, and therefore aren't, strictly speaking, irrational beliefs, because they're trying to make sense of the kind of experience that they're having. So maybe the person who has, Cotard's delusion is thinking to them, having kind of experience of non-ownership of their body, or they're depersonalized, anyway. So I think, so that's a big debate. And I think sort of your position would be, no, they still would be irrational because the experiences themselves conflict with what we know about science or something like that. So I guess I disagree with you there. But anyway, so I would disagree that the experience itself is delusional. I think beliefs based on the experience may be, or not, delusional, but the experiences themselves are just experiences.
We'll take Oliver Sacks. Oliver Sacks was, I'm sure you're familiar with him. He did lots of research on certain kinds of
the man who mistook his wife for a hat.
Yeah, and he would always see these different shape delusions on the ceiling. And would it be rational for him to believe that these shape delusions exist, or is it rational for him to believe I'm having this neurological or hallucination, and I know it's a hallucination, so it's irrational for me to conclude they're real?
Yeah, but this is kind of the whole point that I've been making all along, is I think it depends on your background beliefs. So Oliver Sacks was kind of, had certain views that led him to think these are not veridical experiences. Other people may have background beliefs that lead them to take them more seriously. I don't think that one is more rational than the other, which is kind of what starts. So that's what the point that I was trying to make about the spiritual stuff. So you say we have lots of reasons to think that this is a delusional belief that you have based on this experience. And I was trying to argue that actually we don't have that. There's no evidence that suggests one way or the other whether these are veridical or not. Everything that we know about near-death experiences, religious experiences, is compatible with them being true, and also compatible with them being not true. And science doesn't tell us anything about that, since these are not claims about the empirical world at all. And science only answers those kind of questions.
Well, I would disagree. I'd say science tells us a lot about those things. I think it's incredibly rational to conclude that based off of the evidence we have in neurology, that those are in fact delusions or hallucinations, whichever term you want to use. Based on the evidence we have, that is a incredibly rational conclusion. And I think that the difference in our position is where I would agree that like the 5-year-old child is rational to conclude that there is a Santa. But if you're looking at it from a perspective of you could either be the child or the parent, and you choose to be the child, I would say that's irrational. I would say that because you have access to both qualities of evidence, if you choose the lesser quality of evidence, you are irrational. Like if you didn't have a choice, obviously you can't choose. But if you're someone in the modern technology who has the background availability of the modern neuroscience, and you choose to ignore that and choose to be the child, I would say that's irrational. I'd say that's kind of like what the the ontological argument is doing in that context. So I think that it wouldn't be irrational for the child. It would be irrational for someone who could be either and chooses to be the child.
Yeah,
And that's
but
what I
I don't think you've established that. So I agree with you about. So by the way, I have a 5-year-old child, and they know there is no Santa. I told them. Want to lie to the child, and he was kind of sad at the beginning, and I was like, he was like, oh, there's no Santa, and I was like, well, there's no Mario either, but you love Mario, and he was like, oh yeah. So it doesn't really matter. It's like, it's all pretend, right? Let's go play Mario now. And so I think I'm against lying to children. I don't lie to my son. I'm against lying, generally speaking. I think it actually does harm to lie to children. So some people get very mad about that, but I think it's actually wrong to tell children that there is a Santa. I especially am super offended by, I was on an airplane. I'm totally on a non sequitur now, but I was on an airplane once, and the fucking pilot, dude, the pilot of the plane, like announced, we were flying on Christmas Eve. He announced over the intercom, oh, we just spotted Santa flying, and everyone's looking. I was like, motherfucker, dude, this is like mass conspiracy against children. This shit pisses me off. Anyway, and I was lied to as a kid. I was very angry. I found out there was no Santa accidentally because I saw my mom wrapping a present. I woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. I saw them wrapping a present. And then in the morning, I saw the same present under the tree. It said "From Santa." I was like, "Motherfucker, dude! You guys did that." So I think I was 7. I was like, my mom was like, "Don't tell your sister." I was like, "Oh, I'll fucking tell her, dude." Anyway, so yes, I agree. We shouldn't. The kid is being misled into believing that there is a Santa when really we have lots of reasons to expect that there is no Santa, and that it's a mistake. If you had to choose one versus the other, it would be a mistake to choose belief in Santa. Although that's part of the narrative, by the way. I mean, oh my God, we were reading the Polar Express, and it's like, oh, you can only hear the bell if you believe in. So fuck you, dude. Fuck all that shit. Fuck it. It's a conspiracy idea. Anyway, so that if you get older, the world is more magical from the point of view of science and more wonderful from the point of view of science than it is from this alternative point of view, in my opinion.
Anyway, yeah, totally. Space bending totally destroys any God concept. Like that's ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. The concepts that from relativity theory and quantum mechanics are more wonderfully awe-inspiring, majestic than anything you'll ever read in any science fiction apocalypse story called the Bible. Okay, anyway, so I agree with all that, but where I don't think where I see the disconnect, to me anyway, where I see the disconnect is that, how to put this? I don't think that we have any good reason from the point of view of science to think that these kinds of experiences are false. Whereas you seem to think we do have lots of good reason to think. So if I woke up in the middle of night and I saw a fat, hairy motherfucker coming down my chimney with a bag of presents, putting them under the present, I would start believing in Santa. I would repent. I'd be like, fuck Santa, dude. Yes, totally. And if no one else had seen that, then yeah, I would think, okay, so why aren't other people observing this? That would be something I would worry about. But I don't think that I would be irrational for thinking, I know what I saw. I saw Santa. Now, if I found out later I'd been on acid at the time, then yeah, I would rethink it. But if I was, so anyway, I think that my personal experience counts for something. It's not nothing. So some people have experiences of these otherworldly events. And you say, well, no, we know from science that we could produce those same experiences in the brain. But that doesn't establish that the experiences are not veridical experiences. So the fact that I can produce hallucinations in you doesn't show that normally when my perceptual systems are functioning correctly, that I'm hallucinating. I don't think I'm having a hallucination right now, even if I can have a dream just like this, even if you can produce the same experience by sticking electrodes in my head. That doesn't seem to me reason to accept that right now at this moment, what I'm having is a hallucination. So now you say, but wait a minute, the reason why is because other people will walk into the room and see the table and so forth. And I say, yeah, that's fantastic. But in the case of the spiritual stuff, these are not empirical things that we're talking about. They're non-physical things. So my experience of the non-physicalness of them seems to refute the point that you're making. Science does not have anything to tell us about the nature of non-physical objects. In fact, I don't even think science has anything to tell us about the nature of the quantum world. I think the job of science is to answer questions about what we will observe. And it does a quite good job at that. But it doesn't tell us anything about these. Science doesn't refute Platonism about numbers, and science doesn't refute the existence of all knowing, all perfect, morally, blah, blah, blah. It's not talking about that. It's saying, science is saying, if you look over here, you'll observe X. If you look over there, you'll observe Y. If you tweak it in this way, you'll observe this corresponding thing over here. So that's what it talks about. It doesn't talk about these other things at all. It does. In fact, self-consciously, its job is to ignore those things.
Well, the two things there. First is how would that be different if you said, I saw a non-physical demon or whatever, this isn't talking about the physical world, from a person saying, I saw the TV levitate, and there's lots of scientists in the room, they also see the TV, it's not levitating, but I was just seeing an alternate world, an M theory alternate timeline or whatever, where it did levitate. Obviously, science doesn't disprove that either. But significantly, we're probably going to say, I don't think so. I think probably more likely delusion. So it seems in the case of the demon, you should be even more reasonable to conclude that's a delusion because it induces this entire new ontology than it is to conclude that they were just looking into a different M theory world where there's all possible worlds. I think it would be more reasonable to conclude that is rational than to conclude that there is a new ontology of demons. And I think we clearly conclude that they're seen to another world is not veridical. So we think that's probably a hallucination. So we should be especially rational to conclude the demon is hallucinating. The second thing is, I think science is the ways we use to differentiate imagination from reality. That's the point of science, from my perspective. The point of science is this thing we're seeing something that only exists in our imagination, or does it exist independent of our imagination? That is the point of science. It is to differentiate those two things. And I think the whole goal of everything we've collected in science is the reliable methods we have to do that. And if it can't meet one of those reliable methods, it's probably one of the imaginary things, which is the conclusion we've come to after thousands of years of doing science. There's so many imaginary things we think exists, and here are all the ways we have to show if it is or isn't one of them, with a certain level of reliability. So if it can't be shown to be not one of them, it's probably one of the imaginary things. So I think that's the point of science, is to differentiate, is it just a thing in our head, or is there a reason to believe it exists in reality? And obviously it can't prove everything does or doesn't exist.
Reality.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I'd say any reality. So I'd say that if there was a non-physical reality, like if I could pray to God and get a gold brick, that would be evidence of a God. I'm happy to grant that would be evidence of a non-physical God or a supernatural anything. Like if you can make a testable prediction, that would work as a way to show this is a non-imaginary thing, regardless of where it exists. If it's supernatural, whether it's physical, whether it's a Platonic object, it would make no difference to me at all. If you can show it's not imaginary by any of the currently reliable means, regardless of where it is, that counts. I'm happy to count that as evidence. So I wouldn't just say,
why aren't you a Platonist?
No testable predictions. If you made testable predictions for Platonism,
It's not testable predictions.
What?
They're just mathematical.
What do you mean? I have no idea what you mean.
If Platonism were true, then you would expect things like Cantor's proof and forcing the continuum hypothesis. You would expect all of these things, and that there would be ways of differentiating claims about this realm. In fact, we have lots of these ways of differentiating. They're called proofs and so forth, and intuition and blah blah blah. So that's a reason to think that these things are real, according to you, because there are some predictions or mathematical predictions. There's a way of differentiating them. It's called proofs and intuition. And so I don't understand why by your own lights you don't accept the existence of the Platonic realm.
But were those predictions Platonism made? Because I'm not familiar with those being predictions Platonism made, or anybody made for that matter. I don't know how that.
Well, it depends on what you mean by a prediction. So when they have when Hilbert came up with his outstanding problems in mathematics, the prediction was that there should be an answer to these problems, and there was. That the Riemann hypothesis. I mean, that's not one, but the ABC conjecture or whatever thing that the continuum hypothesis, any of these things that are out there. In fact, the continuum hypothesis, I think, is a kind of interesting one. Whether alpha naught is the next great. There's a level of infinity between
countable internets, yeah,
and uncountable. What the order of them is, and all that sort of stuff. And so it turns out that you can do it both. You can do it both ways. It's provable and also not provable, depending on your assumptions and how you do things. So it's independent of set theory as we understand it. And I don't know.
Well, so yeah, if like there's like a Platonist,
yeah.
So if there was a Platonist who made these predictions that these things will work, and there were non-Platonists who said, nah, if Platonism wasn't true, these things would not work, and then yeah, I'd count that as evidence of Platonism. I don't know if that's ever occurred. I don't think that has. Well,
I think your standard of prediction is too high, because the prediction is just that there is a method which can answer these questions. And in fact, we have employed that method and answered these questions.
But isn't that same prediction made under non-Platonism? Like,
right? Yeah, exactly, exactly. So, but they're not in the same way. I mean, so if well, I don't know. By the way, I have another meeting at 2:00 or my time, 2:00. So about 10 minutes I have to go.
okay.
I felt like we could be talking here forever. But anyway, so
let me just clarify what I mean by prediction here. So I'm saying that I have a hypothesis. I'm going to predict something we don't know yet. If my hypothesis is true, it doesn't even matter if they're connected. I don't even care. I predict round squares, and I predict there's going to be a teapot floating around Alpha Centauri. That's evidence of round squares. I don't even care if it's connected. So if you can make a prediction about something we don't know yet with some hypothesis you have, and no one else has made this prediction yet, no one else has even conceived of it, then yeah, that would be evidence of your hypothesis, whatever it is. Don't even care. So, but if you're predicting something like the sun's going to rise tomorrow when everybody predicts it because it's just based off what we already know, then that wouldn't count as evidence of anything. So I'd say, so if these predictions that Platonism made, Platonism makes some kinds of predictions about some kind of mathematical relations that nobody knows yet, and nobody has even the inkling of yet, and they get it right, and we discover it's right in 100 years, yeah, I would count that as evidence for Platonism for sure. But if it's just predicting the same things we already kind of expect under every ideology, I'd say probably not a prediction.
Yeah, but why isn't that just confusing Platonism with empirical science? I mean, it's not the job of mathematics to make those sorts of claims. That's not what it does. It doesn't make predictions in that sense. Its job is to do something different.
Oh, well, I'm including predictions here of solving mathematical problems or something. Like if you make predictions about some kind of mathematical relations, like you'll be able to solve the Riemann hypothesis or whatever with this kind of method or blah, blah, blah. I'm happy to count that as evidence too. I'm not specifically saying it has to be an empirical prediction.
Evidence? So why doesn't it count as evidence that people come up with these? I mean, so there are these differences, right? Sometimes people come up with a proof, and so a couple of times people thought that they had proved the parallel postulate, and then later mathematicians came along and found a mistake in the proof. That seems like something that Platonism has a better way of handling than your view, because if there's an objective fact of the matter, then you would expect consensus to conform to, people all recognize the mistake once it was pointed out. And so what are they all agreeing on? It sounds like if it's just definitions, then we can define them any way we want. And this is, so Hume didn't take things far enough. This is where Quine comes in. Quine comes in and says, you know what, actually, if you really want to be an empiricist, I mean, WVO Quine, the American philosopher.
Yep.
If you really want to be an empiricist.
TJump empiricism.
Well, that's one of his most famous papers. If you want to be a real empiricist, then you have to also accept the idea that we can change these definitions because we own them. They work for us. So if I want to reject the law of non-contradiction, I can. In fact, that is perfectly fine. I'll adopt a non-standard logic. I'll go talk to Grand Priest and adopt what he calls L3 or whatever. So I can have a many valued logic or anything I want. I can be dialethic, pairs consistent, sort of thing there. So, but it doesn't seem like that's what you actually get. So the prediction from your camp. I mean, when you tell people that it's possible that 7 + 5 might equal 15 in the future, they sort of look at you funny. And then you say, oh, that's just because you're defining 7 plus 5 to equal 12, but I'll just change the definition and then we'll come up with a different answer. They go, wait a minute, there's a fact of the matter here about 7 and 5 equaling 12, which seems independent of us. So that's the prediction is that more people, I mean, I guess it's not even a prediction, but it's just that the Platonist has a better answer.
Well, my answer is just math. My answer is math refers to reality. So reality is reality. There you get one, and then you can just do different kinds of subdivision of the numbers to get more stuff about reality. So I don't think it's ever going to change. I don't think reality.
Continuum hypothesis has nothing to do with reality.
Well, I think it does. I think it's just an extension of the math that is based on reality. So I think that all usages of math, as in like 1 plus 1, the standard number system, set theory, are all based off of math that is derived from reality. So I don't think any version of math can't have something to not do with reality inherently.
But it's not a claim about reality, or as if it is, it's a claim about non-physical reality. So take a set of axioms that define like Robinson arithmetic. So it's you can. It's the simplest thing before you get to the piano axioms. Even it's just so define these things. There's a number that's doesn't have that's 0. For any number that isn't 0, it has a successor, a number that comes after it, and then you define some operations on these things. And the claim is that these things hold of necessity. That's not a claim about physical reality.
I think it is. So I think all of the claims about math are claims about reality. I think all things that like A equals A, law of identity, is describing reality. I think the number 1 is describing reality. I think all numbers and all logic are derived from reality. So I think.
Yeah, but I didn't say that though. What I said was that the claim that it's necessarily true isn't a claim about reality. It can't be verified by reality. We don't have any experience that suggests that that's accurate, not empirically anyway. If you really accept that, you should be Aquinian and think that tomorrow it could all change and A equals A might not be true. But I don't really feel like you feel that it's true.
No, I think that I think that all math and logic derive from reality, and just reality. Reality is reality. That's logic, and there is one reality. That's math. And I don't think those things could change.
That's not what it means to say 1 plus 1 equals 2. That's not what it means. And 1 plus 1 equaling 2 doesn't mean take one object, put it next to another object, and then count them and have 2 objects. That's not what it means. It means there's some abstract mathematical claim that's always true, which is and some of the formal system can be derived. So the fact that that happens to somehow capture a fact or mirror something about physical reality is accidental. And not important.
Well, I'd say it is important. So I take the view that, yeah, it is. It's just describing reality. So all of our math is just abstract ideas that derive from specifically just reality. So math and logic are just describing reality, and that's it. I had in my first conversation with Rob Koons, he talked about a whole bunch of different people in philosophy trying to do this. I don't know any of them, so I can't really talk about it. But he says this is a view that is held by a number of people.
That doesn't make it right.
I know.
It's not the consensus view in philosophy by any means at all. So if consensus matters at all, then you are not you don't have it at all. One of these guys is Mill. Maybe Mill is a guy. Mill thought that all mathematical facts were empirical generalizations, basically. And that is like widely thought to be ridiculous. I actually think it's true. I hold all the crazy views in philosophy. I don't give a fuck. But a lot of people think that that's just like the silliest thing they ever heard. And a lot of math that we have is really just not based on anything empirical. I don't know what you think what empirical reality the continuum hypothesis is even talking about, a lot of a really abstract advanced math doesn't seem like it has anything to do with the physics. I mean, the ABC conjecture, things about, every number has can be the sum of prime numbers. That's a different Goldbach or whatever. So these conjectures, they don't seem like they have anything to do with physical reality. What the hell does that have to do with physical reality? That the fact that any number can be expressed as the sum of prime numbers.
Anything that uses 1 has to do with reality. Anything that uses any number has to do with reality.
But that's not logic. That's not math. You need more than that. You need axioms. You need a rule system. You need to reason about it. So simply starting from something. So you could also say there's many. So there's one. There's also many. So which one is the basis of this? So A doesn't equal A. That could be the basis of this. I don't. Why think that the fact that reality is the way that it is tells you anything about what the correct logic is or the correct rules by which to deduce things, The modus ponens is a good rule to follow, but there, in logic, there are these famous cases of perverse instantiations of modus ponens, or I guess what was the name of this famous modus morons or something like that? I think it was called, where you infer from if P then Q, and P you infer not P or something like. So you can always have all sorts of weird rules. How does that connect to reality at all? Doesn't seem clear. And in fact, even if reality were very, very, very different from the way that it is, it still seems like we could define formal systems whereby 1 + 1 = 2. It would still be true that 1 + 1 = 2. It just wouldn't describe our world.
I don't know how that would be the case. I don't think it could be 1 + 1 = 2, but doesn't describe our world. I don't know how that could be the case. I'd have to.
Well, there's all sorts of mathematical systems where 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. I mean, you can have non-standard systems where 2 + 2 = 5.
Taxi cab math kind of stuff.
Yeah, you can do all sorts of things. Yeah, it's just a set of rules that you define. So according to you, if it's just a bunch of definitions, but not latching on into anything which is like objectively the case about mathematics, then it doesn't seem like there's any special status here. Anyway, I hate to cut this off. We didn't even get to talk about the thing I thought we were going to talk about, which was whether we should celebrate Christmas as atheists and all that shit. So I hate to say it, Tom, we're gonna have to fucking third.
Oh god, how terrible is that going to be? Just so miserable. Need to bring a tinfoil hat for next time, though, for sure.
Yeah, I'll definitely bring my tinfoil hat for next time.
Exactly. Great talking with you. I will let you go to another meeting. We'll set up again for the third time.
Cool. Thanks. Keep up the good work. Doing the good work. You're fighting the good fight. So I appreciate it.